Welcome to International Geneva. The fight against climate change has sparked a global debate about implementing a carbon tax, also here in Switzerland. But while the carbon tax is backed by experts and economists as a cost-effective and efficient way to cut CO2 emissions, can we expect a major shift? The Graduate Institute here in Geneva has done a lot of research on this topic, and joining me now to discuss is Professor Urs Luterbacher. So Urs, let's take a look at the global picture first. The carbon tax has a very patchy history, especially in the US, but also around the world. And it's only widely accepted here in Europe, especially in Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and in Switzerland. Why is that?
Well, let's first talk a little bit about what a carbon tax is, okay? The carbon tax goes back to an idea that was proposed first by a British economist named Pigou in the 1920s, saying you should not tax goods, but you should tax bads. And in this case, carbon emissions we know now are quote-unquote bad, and therefore they should be taxed in such a way that their price goes up, so that people will choose other ways of producing energy or heating or whatever.
So why did it take decades to bring this debate back to the table and on the agenda?
Well, because the idea is very attractive in theory, but in reality there are all kinds of problems with it. First of all, one can evoke the international problem. What if countries have different levels of carbon taxation, which means that there will be different prices of carbon per country, and you could expect disruption of trade flows in that case. So the ideal would of course be a worldwide carbon tax. Some people have suggested that, but that's not an easy thing to establish.
Well, many economists and supporters, including you, are supporting a carbon tax because it can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and boost the use of alternative energy and green energy. But is it really helping?
Well, that's a big question. And personally, I look very favorably to carbon taxes, but my preferred system would have been a generalized cap-and-trade scheme.
Why?
Because with a cap-and-trade scheme, you can target exactly the level of carbon you want to reach. You say, we want to cut emissions by X%, and we're going to adjust a permit system that will allow us to do that by distributing this permit system either among countries or within a country to either individuals or to industries. However, such a system is institutionally also very difficult to put in place.
So what are the major hurdles in that case, and why should we then instead implement a carbon tax? Could this make a real difference?
A carbon tax is easier from an institutional point of view. Governments say, we will tax carbon, and one has to be careful here. The idea is to tax carbon, not CO2. Okay? It's the carbon content that is taxed. And one taxes at in such a way as the price of carbon reaches 90, 120 to 110 francs or dollars a ton. And through that, hopefully, we can achieve a significant reduction in carbon use.
Well, the jury is out, actually, whether the carbon tax could make a difference. Do you believe it could?
I think if it's properly applied, it could make a difference. The problem is that you always get in practically every country then lobbies who are then fighting for an exemption. And in some of the Nordic countries that you mentioned before, this has been or is the case still. So for instance, that exports industries pay less. Sometimes like fishermen pay less, or farmers pay less. And if you keep increasing the number of people who are exempt from it, then it loses effectivity.
And as you mentioned, a lot of governments in Europe and around the world are still against it. There's a lot of political opposition. What is the main argument from these opponents?
Well, the main argument here is the fact, and it's very real in some ways. We saw it again in the problems that France is experiencing right now. A carbon tax has what is called a regressive impact, in the sense that it's paid by everybody, whether you earn 50,000 francs a year or 100,000 francs or 200,000 francs. You pay just based upon your consumption of carbon products. And for people at the bottom of the wage scale, this can be a big problem, because if suddenly, you know, their means of transportations, and if they're dependent on a car, this is even true for Switzerland. Even Switzerland is very well organized in terms of public transportation. You have remote parts of the country, like in the mountains or whatever, people are dependent on cars, and as a result they get specially hit by such a tax.
And taxation is always a very sensitive and political issue.
Exactly, and as we have seen in France, you know, the idea of a carbon tax, which was proposed by the government, actually led to the current revolt of the yellow vests. So it is a very sensitive issue, and actually in a study that we have done using artificial intelligence methods to do textual analysis, we found out that in advance, that this was going to be a problem in France.
Let's talk about Switzerland as well, Urs. Now in December, the National Council rejected the CO2 law on the domestic reduction targets, and also taxing plane tickets as well to cut the greenhouse gas emissions. How do you see the future of Switzerland's climate change policy?
Basically, the idea is right now seems to be to raise the price of carbon within Switzerland, which is probably in and of itself a good idea. The question is, how does one deal with all the problems that I mentioned before, namely the regressive effect of such a taxation and the exemption problem? In other words, are sectors of industry or of the public going to be exempt or not from this level of taxation? And one has to think about the problems that France is experiencing currently. That could also happen in Switzerland, that people just would revolt, and there are some signs about that. You might have heard about a recent vote in the canton of Bern refusing a legislative disposition at the cantonal level to eliminate heating by fuel.
So would you imagine that we could see a big revolt in terms of unrest because of the climate change
Maybe not
issue?
unrest, but there
more
could
demonstrations.
be.
We have seen young people, students already taking to the streets in Zurich, in other cities here in Switzerland, to really protest against climate change.
Well, you know, these people are entirely right, and I'm wholeheartedly with them. The problem is that most of the increase that we will witness over the next few decades will not be in Europe, but in Asia. And it's mostly going to be China to some extent and India to a large extent. And we don't really have any control over policies going on in these two countries. So it's very well and good to do stuff in our part of the world, but one has to be aware of the fact that that by itself is not going to solve the problem.
Now let's talk about the CO2 legislation that we have here in Switzerland and which will run out in 2020. Since 2008 we have a CO2 levy, which is an incentive tax basically on fossil combustible fuels, especially natural gas and heating oil.
Exactly, but that's only for heating.
Right,
that's
but
only
do you
for
think
heating.
now we should have a general national carbon tax at this point?
It would be desirable to have such a thing, but then one would have to rethink the whole taxation system of fuels for transportation that we have right now.
And do you think we should do that right now?
Well, that would be the logical thing to do, yes, to have a complete overhaul of the present system. This being said, there was a recent study by OECD that shows that Switzerland currently is actually taxing carbon the most of all the OECD countries.
But by when do you think or hope that we could actually implement a broader national carbon tax system here in Switzerland?
Well, if one follows my lead, which is to a complete overhaul of the system that we have now, that will take some time. And you know, like usual in the Swiss system, one would have to negotiate this with various industrial and commercial partners, plus the main political party. So it's not an easy thing to do. What the fact that the revision of the current scheme was defeated in Parliament is also due to the fact that these negotiations were not well conducted for the moment.
So a tax seems impossible at this point because we have so many political fractions in the Swiss parliament and the parties cannot agree. So it seems almost impossible to reach that.
Well, there seems to be an evolution on the part mostly of the Liberal Party recently, who seems to be more open to find some scheme that could satisfy everybody. It seems that one has a big opposition for the moment between the people in industry and the small businesses, the Gewerbeverband, who don't want a very heavy tax, but I'm sure some kind of middle road type of scheme could be found in the usual Swiss way of negotiating between the various participants.
But it will take time because the next session for the Council of States to discuss this issue is going to be in September, and then the draft will go back to the National Council. So it will take probably months, if not years.
Probably that will be the case. So maybe provisionally what could be done is just to extend the current legislation and talk about a global overhaul of the whole taxation system in the future.
Now, in terms of the price range of this carbon tax, what do you imagine? As of 2018, the current tax is 96 Swiss francs per CO2 ton. Should it be much higher in the future?
Well, if you want to achieve something, yes, it should be higher. Now the question is to what extent are people in the street and in industry going to accept a taxation scheme that is that high? Because,
how do you see the public opinion? We've mentioned possible riots even in the streets of Switzerland.
Switzerland, people usually don't riot, but there could be lots of local initiatives or, you know, with lots of votes stopping the whole thing. So one has to negotiate with the various partners here, but I'm sure a solution is possible. Maybe not as low as industry apparently is not willing to go above 120 francs per ton, but maybe, you know, they can live with 150 or something like that. So it's at the same time an ecological price, but it's also a political price that has to be negotiated between the partners, and one has to make sure then when that happens that part of it is used, part of it could be refunded to the public, but part of it could also be used to foster new technologies. And there is some very interesting research going on at both of our technical schools in Lausanne and Zurich.
Would you wish that you had put more pressure on a political level on the different parties in Switzerland and really pushed the envelope for more action with regards to the carbon tax issue?
Well, at the time, there was a big discussion because the EU trading scheme was not yet in place. So the issue was really, should we rather go for a trading scheme or for a tax or both? and the proper mix was not yet discussed at the time. Nowadays, we're facing a much greater degree of urgency concerning the climate issue. If we continue the way we are, and this is mostly developments in Asia, we are eventually doomed. So we have to really act at some level, and it's better always to have the notion that it's important to act for the world rather than for just Switzerland.
Before we go, Urs, we are here in Geneva, and there are many international organizations, United Nations Environment Programme, other NGOs, the Environment House, for example. How can the city play a bigger role when it comes to the carbon tax issue?
Well, all these organizations are basically very useful, and they do a lot of things. Every week there is an event that is sponsored by these organizations, but it's very hard for them to reach the public at large, and a lot of Swiss organizations, including even in industry, are not aware of the international efforts that are made in this context. Something that should also be perhaps set to contribution is the whole Swiss financial industry. Now,
Where do
that's
you
a different
see
problem.
need for action in the Swiss financial industry? Do you think that the big banks, the big pension funds, institutional investors should really tackle the issue of carbon tax?
Well, what they should do first perhaps is to try to reduce their investments in fossil fuels. That's really very important.